So, good morning, everyone. It's still morning. Thank you for coming here today to listen to Professor Douglas Weber, who is going to talk about interregionalism. Does it really exist? A challenging topic. I have to say that it's all my fault that there is this topic here, and that I asked Douglas to dig into this. It's not an easy task at all. Douglas Weber is professor of political science at the famous international business school INSEAD in beautiful Paris. And I understand INSEAD also has a campus in Singapore, so also in this particular region. Douglas has been associated with the Monash European and EU Center for a number of years now, and is an adjunct principal research fellow. He has been also a visiting international fellow at the Monash European and EU Center several times, and this is another time, so welcome back, Douglas. Douglas has also published extensively in a lot of different journals in the US, the UK, Germany, and has worked at universities and research institutes in New Zealand. You're originally from New Zealand. Also in Australia, where I think you have some parents as well. The UK, Germany, and Italy, and he has many research interests, one of which is regional political integration in Europe and Asia, but he's also a specialist in German politics, which is very interesting these days, with what's happening in the elections in Germany, and also Franco-German relations, and more broadly, EU politics. So, welcome back, Douglas, and I can't wait to listen to this, because I've been doing a bit of thinking about this myself, and I know how to deal with this. So thank you to be brave enough to tackle this topic.
Thank you very much, Pascaline, for your kind introduction, and thank you for the possibility to return to Monash and to the European Centre for I think the third time in 4 years. I'm very pleased to give this session, and thank you and all the colleagues in the Centre for your hospitality during the time that I've been here, and I hope some stage I can, of course, come back again. I don't envy the fact that you have to spend something like 4 hours in this lecture theatre this morning. This seems to me to be quite a tall order. I never feel very comfortable conducting teaching or sessions in sort of dark holes in the ground as this is. When I saw it was taking place in the lecture theatre HB40, I was reminded of UB40. Do any of you know UB40? You mean the rock group? No, you mean the song Red Red Wine? Yeah, great song. Do you know where the title comes from in the first place, UB40? Why the rock band actually gave itself this name. It is the kind of form you have to fill out in the UK to apply for unemployment benefits. It was a kind of statement about sort of the condition of British society and high levels of unemployment, I think, in the 1980s in the UK. I hope we never have to fill out the corresponding form in Australia. So, before I get down to the actual topic, a couple of things I ought to stress before I go any further. We have 2 hours ahead of us, so I will certainly break up the session, as is the normal custom, I think, so that we can sort of stretch our legs a little bit, maybe around midday. The other thing is that you should feel free to make comments and raise questions during the session. Don't be afraid to raise your arm and say anything that comes to your mind. And in any case, however, I will ensure that in the second part of this morning session we have more of a discussion than perhaps in the first half. Okay? So, interregionalism. It's actually a relatively recent concept, as far as I know, and something that really became quite fashionable as a research topic, I think especially in the 1990s. I don't think you find very much literature actually about the topic before this period. And this probably has a lot to do with the fact that the 1990s, I think at least for the benefit of hindsight, were something like a kind of golden age of regionalism. If you look around the world, many of the regional organizations that currently exist were launched in the period from, let's say, the late 1980s onwards. And there are other older ones, such as the European Union, such as ASEAN, underwent a kind of renaissance during this period, launching new kinds of programs, policies, and trying to forge closer links than it currently existed. Arguably, perhaps the particular project which set in train many of these sort of regional organizations and their foundation was the Single Market Program in Europe, starting from the mid-1980s, which caused a lot of concern and worry other countries and other parts of the world that something like a fortress Europe might be emerging so that countries and their firms elsewhere in the world wouldn't have the same favorable terms of access to the European market that they had previously enjoyed. But in any case, if you think of organizations like the Gulf Cooperation Council in the Persian Gulf, you think about Mercosur in South America, you think about NAFTA, for example, in North America, you think about the ASEAN +3 in East Asia. Many of these organizations or forums saw the light of day really at some stage during the 1990s. In connection with this, and given the foundation of all of these, the pressure of all these sort of regional organizations, there was a widespread conviction, again around the late 1990s, early 2000s, that something like a regionalized world political and economic order was actually beginning to emerge. This would be, or would have been, had it emerged, the successor, if you like, to the bipolar world of the Cold War, in which most states around the world basically lined up in one of two blocks, either that led by the United States and the democratic and capitalist West, and that led by the Soviet Union, if you like, in the communist state-controlled economic part of the world. One example of this, something actually come across in a Singaporean newspaper some years ago, was this prognosis that there would be basically a three-block or a tripolar world order. One based on Europe, other based on North, or perhaps even the entire sort of American continent, and then a third pole, basically consisting of the economies of Asia, which of course during this period were beginning to actually take off and become far more dynamic and far more important players in the international economy. Assuming that something like a regionalized world order was in the process of emerging around this time, a second and related question, and practically a very important question, was, well, if you're going to have these ever more sort of consolidated, ever more tightly integrated blocks around the world based on these three large continents, it's very important to actually see and have some idea of how their relationships among each other might actually develop and turn out over time. And there one can distinguish, I think, between two sort of ideotypical outcomes. If you are sort of a good Europeanist, then basically you're very much in favor of regional cooperation, and it's pretty much the official sort of doctrine of the EU. If you look at their security strategy from the year 2003, that regional organizations are a good thing. They strengthen regional governance by taking care in their regions of all kinds of cross-border issues that otherwise might not be addressed or might not be addressed so peacefully, and they make an important contribution to a more orderly world. Assuming, obviously the assumption here is that regions can somehow get along fairly well together. That would be the sort of the most favorable possible outcome of the emergence of some kind of regionalized world order. On the other hand, at the other extreme, if we go back to the very famous novel of the British writer George Orwell, published in 1949, book 1984. In this book, Orwell actually paints a picture of a world in which there are three orders, pretty much similar to the kind that was predicted would emerge in the late 1990s. namely one block based on what's called Oceania. This is really the United States, the Americas, Australasia, and the United Kingdom. A second one called Eurasia, an Orwell's book, really that comprises the continent, the European continent, including notably Russia, as well as the other Western European countries. And then thirdly, a block that he calls East Asia, which, as the label sort of suggests, of course, would comprise such countries as China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. And in Orwell's rather forbidding book, these three sort of blocks are in a condition of perpetual war against each other. Quite a long time since I read 1984. I don't know if any of you have read it. I can't recall exactly why Orwell was so pessimistic as to the possibility of these different blocks coexisting peacefully, but in any case, this is at the extreme other end of the spectrum of possible outcomes to that which the official sort of doctrine of the EU maintains. So we want to have some idea, perhaps at the end of today's session, as to firstly, perhaps whether or not some kind of regionalized world order might emerge, and if so, how these three or more regional blocks might interact and how well they might get on with each other. First of all, it doesn't really make any sort of sense to talk about interregional relations without having talked a little bit about regions in the first place. Because if you talk about interregional relations, this presupposes that regional organizations can somehow be sort of coherent and cohesive actors on the world stage, and not simply a kind of forum or a meeting place where different, more or less sovereign nation states come to have some kind of chat and go afterwards without anything actually having been decided and without anything ever being implemented afterwards. Not surprisingly, perhaps, a lot of literature that addressed this question of the capacity of national organizations to act began to appear in the 1990s, pretty much a function, I would say, of the increasing sort of level of political integration in Europe. So this book, this article here, it's actually a chapter in a book to which I refer by Dupiel and Caporaso, was actually about the role played by the European Union in international environmental politics. And for Dupiel and Caporaso, you couldn't really talk about the capacity of any kind of international organization to act unless it fulfilled really sort of four criteria. Firstly, other actors, notably states, had to recognize that this organization actually exists and is somehow legitimate. Secondly, the international organization must have some kind of legal competence to act. So the members of the organization, member states of the organization, must have granted it some powers to actually do X, Y, or Z. Thirdly, such organizations had to have a certain amount or minimal amount of autonomy vis-a-vis their member states. They couldn't simply be the extended arm, the long arm of their most powerful members, whether it's Germany and Europe, the United States and North America, South Africa and Southern Africa, Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf, and so on and so forth. And then fourthly, they had to have a certain level of cohesion. That's to say, the capacity to actually, to negotiate amongst each other and to come to some common decisions which then the member states would implement back in their respective territories. So these are four criteria by which we might be able or might attempt to assess the extent to which different international, including regional organizations, have the capacity to actually act and affect, have a material impact on the outcomes of international conflicts. Let's apply this kind of analysis now to regions and to regional organizations in particular. And this is an exercise which has been undertaken, interestingly again, roughly around the same time, by two Scandinavian political scientists, Björn Hettner and Fredrik Söderbaum, I think actually both Swedish. And these two social scientists actually have sort of pondered over the question or the concept of regionness. To what extent and according to what criteria can we assess whether or not a region actually has some kind of identity and capacity to adopt and to implement common policies. And they actually distinguish between regions according to these 5 separate components or categories. At the most basic, one could talk about a regional space as being fundamentally or basically just some kind of geographical unit. Perhaps united by the fact that there are some kind of mountain ranges on the sort of border, some kind of rivers, at least a sort of physical geography which permits the inhabitants of this sort of neighborhood to actually interact with each other more perhaps than they would with countries or societies lying further afield. Secondly, the second highest sort of stage of regionness would be a regional complex in which there's actually an increased level of interaction between the inhabitants of this geographical space. So it probably implies a certain level of trade or a certain level of movement of people across national borders within this sort of neighborhood. The third highest level of regionness for them is what they describe as a regional society. And this would be characterized by a more sort of intensive level of interaction that characterizes the regional complex and the gradual evolution of certain kinds of rules to actually govern the interaction between different countries in the region. For example, economic interaction, trade. Fourth level of regionness for Hettner and Söderbaum is what they describe as a regional community. You might recall that in the old days, the European Union was actually called the European Community, or the European Economic Community, at least. And at this stage, according to Hettner and Söderbaum, we're talking about basically a region which has organized itself in such a way that it is actually a kind of subject and not merely an object of international politics. And that implies, of course, that there must be some kind of procedures which have been agreed between the member states to actually adopt certain common policies and to actually do certain things, at least, together. The other element of a regional community, which distinguishes it from less developed regions from this perspective, is that you tend to get the emergence of some kind of distinctive regional identity. So people in Europe begin to think of themselves as European, or people in Asia, people in China, Japan, in Singapore, and Indonesia begin to think of themselves as Asian. Or here, people in Australia and in New Zealand start to think of themselves as being Australasian, as having some kind of common identity. Hasn't really got very far in this part of the world, but when you see all the various sports events that takes place, you must conclude, I think, that the regional identity is probably rather weak. Although I did notice that during the coverage of the television of the America's Cup sailing, that the Australian commentators on television were rather sympathetic towards we poor Kiwis, who in the end lost the last 8 races and therefore also lost the America's Cup itself. So, and then finally, for Hettner and Söderbaum, the highest stage of regionness is the formation of what they describe as a region state. They don't say this is quite the same as a nation state, but they imply that this is something like a kind of federal state in which really quite important policy-making powers and prerogatives have migrated from the national level to that the region. So not surprising, so far as Europe is concerned, that in their argument, but by the time the Maastricht Treaty was adopted in the early 1990s with the single currency program and so on, that something like a region state had begun to emerge in Europe. Obviously, if we talk about interregional relations, the more sort of region states you have, the more likely it is that basically different regions can adopt sort of common policies and organize a certain level of interaction. Okay. Based on these two concepts of actorness and regionness, I want to propose as a kind of working definition of interregionalism, the adoption and implementation of common decisions or policies by two or more regions. Which implies, of course, that to have a lot of interregionalism, an effective interregional cooperation, you have to have strong regional organizations that are capable of acting on behalf of their members. Let me try and illustrate and distinguish between different sort of patterns and degrees of relations between different regions with this typology. Imagine we have a region A. In this case, let's say it's Europe. We're talking now entirely sort of theoretically. Let's say we have a region A, Europe, which is relatively weakly integrated, and at the same time a region B, this could be, for our purpose right now, this could be Asia, which is also very weakly politically integrated. In such a scenario, in such a situation, relationships between countries across the different regions will be predominantly bilateral. We'd have a lot of different kinds of bilateral relations. So between, let's say, between Germany and China, between the UK and Singapore, between Indonesia and the Netherlands, between Thailand and Italy, and so on and so forth. And interregional relations would take primarily this kind of format. That's really how the dogma of international relations have been conducted over the course of the many centuries since the emergence of the nation state going back to Europe in the 17th century. If you were to have, for example, a very high level of political integration in Asia, but not much in Europe, then you might say that it's a lot of unilateral relations. By this I mean that relations between, on the Asian side, will be basically conducted primarily by some kind of regional organization, then conducting relations with individual states in Europe, whether Germany, France, Italy, the UK, Sweden, Belgium, or whatever. Third possibility, this is the upper right-hand box here, would be one which probably isn't so far off from characterizing the contemporary situation. It would be a situation where you have a strong European Union which conducts a lot of the relations with individual countries in Asia on behalf of the member states of the European Union. So in this case, the European Union will be interacting with China, with Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and so on. And fourthly and finally, you could talk about interregional relations, in what I would say a kind of meaningful sense, if you had a strongly politically integrated Europe and a strongly politically integrated Asia. That's the bottom right-hand box here. So, in order to talk about sort of interregional relations, it's very important to have some kind of sense of the strength of political integration in different regions around the world. What do I mean when I talk about strong regional organizations or high or strong levels of political integration? I think we can sort of determine how weak or strong regional organizations or how weak or strong the regions are politically using four sort of, by reference to four dimensions. Firstly, it would be important to see to what extent in different regions a single organization basically brings together sort of, you know, all regional cooperation and interaction. So far as Europe is concerned, for example, how many sort of relevant pan-European organizations are there? Is it just the European Union, or are there any other regional organizations in Europe that have an important impact on certain kinds of policies, certain kind of conflicts, certain kind of issue areas?
There's the Council of Europe.
There's the Council of Europe. What does it do? Why not?
I don't know, I just knew of it.
Yeah, it does exist, and arguably it does have an important role. Robert knows maybe.
Okay. Well, Council of Europe in terms of promoting democracy and human rights and sort of political sort of issues among the states. NATO as well, to security.
Okay.
EU as well, I can just mention that.
Sorry?
The European Broadcasting Union.
Good Lord, I hadn't even heard of that. Okay. But for the two most important ones probably indeed would be the NATO. We'll come back to that a little bit later. And indeed the Council of Europe, which, as you rightly said, Robert, has important powers in respect of the promotion of human rights, civil liberties, and such like. I think I'm right in saying, but I may be wrong, virtually every country that can be defined or considered European is actually a member of the Council of Europe, including even Russia. No? So even in Europe, basically, the EU doesn't have basically a monopoly on the organization of regional cooperation. Second dimension might be that of density. Let's stay with Europe. How many European countries don't belong to the European Union? Think of any offhand? Switzerland? Okay, yeah, sure. Sorry? United Kingdom is still there, but in a few years' time, who knows? They may just leave. It's becoming increasingly plausible. I think we can discuss that later on if you would like to do so. Huh? Any other countries apart from Switzerland that don't belong to the European Union but are European?
Some of the Scandinavian countries, like Sweden?
Sweden is a member, but Norway is not. Norway is not, and nor is Iceland, although since they had this terrible economic crisis a few years ago, they've begun to think it might not be a bad idea after all. Huh? You might say, basically, that Norway is staying out of the EU as long as they still have some oil, and Switzerland is staying out as long as they still have some gold and money in the bank vaults under the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich. Any other European countries that don't belong to the EU?
There's the five, what I call them rogue states, the tiny ones, Vatican, San Marino,
Okay.
Monaco, and
Yeah. There are a handful of them. For practical purposes, we can leave them to one side. There may be some other, quite a few other rather large ones, which, depending on how you conceive Europe, are European but don't belong to the EU. Turkey? Yeah.
Russia.
Russia.
Yeah.
Two big ones, the most important ones by far. Because obviously it's a topic of debate and you can have different views on these things. Certainly Turkey, in a geographical sense, doesn't really belong to Europe, or perhaps only in roughly 2 or 5% of its territory is European, that's to say, west of the Dardanelles. And Russia is typically considered to be European, at least as far east as the Ural Mountains. So by this definition, a very large part of Russia, and most Russians would be classified or regarded as European. As you know, Turkey, or Turkish accession is very much an issue for the European Union. Russia hasn't really thought seriously about trying to join the EU, and probably most EU member states are quite happy if that's not the case. Because Russian accession or possibility would certainly raise very sort of serious issues regarding sort of the balance of power between different member states in the organization. Thirdly, breadth. How many issue areas and what kind of issue areas lie within the competence of the regional organization and its organs. So far again as Europe is concerned, what are some of the issue areas that the EU deals with? I'll put it the other way around. What kind of issues in Europe, political issues, does the EU not deal with? How many can you think of?
Oh, they don't deal with the agricultural policy very well. That's a bit of a simple deal.
They don't deal with them very well. Okay, that's not the same thing as not dealing with them at all. But they certainly do deal with agricultural policies, but yes, not in a way that many other countries in the world actually think is good. That's a very understandable remark from someone from this part of the world. We New Zealanders think exactly the same way, I think, most of the time at least. Do you think of many issue areas nowadays in which the EU is not really very involved?
Security?
To a limited extent, it has to be said. Yeah, this is an area where really NATO is dominant. There have, of course, as you probably will know, been attempts since the late 1990s to develop a kind of European security and defense policy, but they haven't in fact got very far, as you see whenever any big issue comes up about military intervention in Libya or in Syria is concerned. The Europeans basically are at odds with each other and basically at sixes and sevens. So they did have this idea to develop some kind of military power projection capacity, and the member states said they would delegate basically a certain number of troops to some kind of European sort of rapid reaction force, but in fact nothing much has come of this. And particularly when the French and the Germans decided in the late 1980s and the 1990s to establish a so-called Eurocorps, which would be the sort of nucleus of the European army. Hardly anybody actually joined up with them. Luxembourg doesn't really have too many soldiers. I think Spain joined at one stage. I think Belgium also doesn't have exactly a very big army either, as far as I know, so the Eurocorps project remained pretty much still born. No? Okay, otherwise there are not too many areas nowadays where the EU doesn't have some kind of competence. You might think about sort of social welfare policies. They're not particularly closely involved in these. If you look at the Eurozone, however, you will see, of course, nowadays that the EU plays an increasingly important role trying to constrain the fiscal policy, expenditure policies of the member states, and even areas like labour relations, where the treaties don't really foresee any role for the EU. The jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice has become an increasingly important sort of constraint on the exercise by trade unions of the right to strike. Then finally, an important sort of element of the strength of the regional organization might be what I would describe as its depth.